And a lot of time, now late in my career at Lockheed, management saw that this didn't happen as much, but a lot of times we sat there at our machines or at our workstation with nothing to do for sometimes days on end. And not being critical, but this actually occurred. And again, we couldn't do anything until the engineers had done their business, till the people ahead of us in line had done theirs, then they passed on to us. And we'd start our work. But WPA, a lot of times, they were afraid of working hard because, hey, we'll work ourselves out of a job. The longer we take on this job, the more money we'll get. Now, a private firm cannot allow this. A private firm has to get the job done and hopefully move on to the next one. And they can't allow workers to sit around. But the government workers piddle around and cost the taxpayers more than a job otherwise would. Now, folk, if you think I'm wrong, you're welcome to say so, but I worked for a government contractor, and I believe I know what I'm talking about. I got to edit this out. No, a lot of persons know what I'm saying to be the truth. All right. Now, the issue that upset the people in Herbert Hoover's day was pensions. The veterans who fought in World War I asked the government to give them their pensions. The government said, oh no, we promised you a pension in 1945. Catch-22. The government knew that a lot of them would not be around by 1945. I mean, the same thing with Social Security, by the way. The government knew that a lot of men and women would not live to be 65. Today we do, a lot of us do. But the government said, so Herbert Hoover would not give them their pensions. Herbert Hoover chased them off the White House yard. And so when President Roosevelt was elected, he wouldn't give them, but he was nicer about it. He and his wife Eleanor went out. He couldn't do it. He would show up, he was crippled. But he sent his wife out, and his wife, accompanied by Secret Service men, went out and gave the men Kool-Aid and gave them cookies to eat and a few, but nicely sent them away without their pensions. But these men appealed to Congress. Congress voted to give them their pensions. Roosevelt vetoed it. Congress passed it over the president's veto. It became law. The men were given their pensions before 1945. So the World War I vets, the ones that were still alive, got their pensions early. And that money, just like had happened during the Depression of 1819, when those Revolutionary War veterans were promised pensions, and when the government paid the pensions in spite of the Depression, I mean, they promised they paid it, and it helped lift the country out of depression. Paying these World War I vets the pensions did help to ease the economic burden somewhat. Now, unions, the government finally, after 20 years of neglecting or discouraging unions, unions were finally encouraged by the government. The CIO was founded, eventually the CIO, Congress of Industrial Equality. Eventually the CIO joined with the AFL and became the AFL-CIO, which was once a powerful union. Now, right now, unions are weak. The time may come when unions will be strong again, but the pendulum goes back and forth. But right now, for one thing, unions are mostly made up of blue-collar, semi-skilled or unskilled workers. There's not very many places that have unskilled help anymore. At Lockheed, just about the only unskilled workers were the janitors and the laundry room workers who washed the rags that the men used to clean airplane parts with. Those rags are often taken to the laundry room and washed by some of the very bottom employees at Lockheed. They were unskilled. But Social Security. That one is still with us, folk. Hey, I did not write that down. Now, I've already mentioned, the catch-22 of Social Security was, initially you could not collect it until you turned 65. And most men in that day did not live to be 65. Okay, now today, we do. Now there's a couple of problems with Social Security, pretty severe problems. It's going bankrupt. And a lot of people say that unless some changes are made, you younger folk will never be able to collect it. Most of my students claim that they have been aware that, all right, I started paying Social Security in 1967 with my first job, about $3 a week. Not a lot, but it got bigger and bigger as time went on. Social Security money was taken out of your paycheck before you get it. This became the first time in history that money was taken from you before you get it. The people would get paid, particular factor worker, and I noticed the federal income tax was withheld, state income tax was withheld. No day you didn't have a choice. Today you have a choice to have it withheld or not. In those days it was something that was taken out against your will. Federal income tax and Social Security, FICA, F-I-C-A. And I remember looking at my first paycheck and went, what is FICA, F-I-C-A? Well, it was Social Security. But that money was not saved for me. Where did the Social Security money go that I got while I was working? It was used to pay the older people who were already on it. And what money am I getting now? I'm getting the money that you people are putting in. Now, how many of you have heard that outside of this class? Now, to my surprise, nobody's raising their hand. I thought most people knew that. Basically, your money you put into Social Security, if you're putting in at all, is not being saved for you. It's being used to pay those of us who are collecting from it. The other problem with Social Security that's really going to hit you people hard, we are not having enough babies. All down through history, old people have been supported by the younger people. And this generation is not having the children, and what this means is the money is not being stored away and saved like it would be if we were having a normal amount of kids. Two reasons. Reason number one is half of the adult population in this country is unmarried. And folk, that is bad. That's really bad. And number two, we have, and this might offend some, I want to say anyway, we have aborted 60 million American babies. And that's going to tell on us down the road. That is 60 times more than all the men and women we've lost in all of our wars combined. You can call it a right. People have a right to conduct themselves in such a way as to guarantee that they're going to be impoverished and conquered later. You can't live any way you choose, folk. You'd better be thinking of what's the best right way to live and live that way.
So you receive Social Security if you don't have a 401k or a pension plan, or you...
Now, if you have a 401k, that money, okay, that's different. A 401k money, that money is your money.
Mm-hmm.
It's being held for you. And I hope the government doesn't decide to take it, because when the government gets poor and poor, they start digging into people's pension plans. This has been going on a little bit. But also, Social Security. Now, if I die first, my wife will keep getting my Social Security check until the day she dies. That Social Security money cannot be passed on to your offspring. Basically, a man who pays Social Security and dies before he's 60, well, it's now down to 62. If he dies before he collects any money, suppose that his wife is already dead. Then he dies before he's 62. None of that money he put in ever goes to his family. His heirs do not collect it. Now your pension, your 401k, that money you can pass on to your heirs, your descendants. Are we clear on that? Social Security money cannot. That's basically you're giving that money and the government uses it as it sees fit. Anybody else have any comment, any questions? I mean, this is important. I mean, folks, you know about this. Anyway, Social Security is still with us. I'll have that the Supreme Court ruled it was constitutional. Now, a bunch of men came on the scene. Father Conklin. I have somewhat of a figure here. Now, Father Conklin ran a radio show. It was not a talk show. In those days, they didn't have the technology for people to call in and their call be broadcast on the air. I mean, maybe they could have done it, but nobody had the idea, and it would have been expensive. State radio stations were not set up to do that. Now, I worked at a couple of stations, and they were, but that was in the 1970s. In the 1930s, Father Conklin was not a talk show. People couldn't call him. He'd get on the radio for about 30 minutes every week and broadcast. And he spoke that everybody should have an income, a guaranteed income, and wages for everybody should be equal. All right. He was really an admirer of Italy's Mussolini. I'm going to write that name down. Who was in charge of a fascist state. Now, all of you think know that today the word fascism or fascist has become a bad word. It connotes an evil dictator. But in those days, Mussolini did not have such a bad name, and fascism was looked on as by some as being it's the solution to the world's economic problems. We must become so. We must take money from the rich that have more than they need and redistribute this money to the poor. But here's what destroyed Father Conklin, something that he could not predict, but something that can happen to anybody. The United States went to war against Mussolini, and Father Conklin was left hanging out on a limb. He became unpopular. He had to get off the air. Nobody would listen to him anymore. And he was never able to make a comeback. He lived a good many years after getting off the air, but he was never able to, he was completely forgotten about in later years, except in the history books. But he was extremely popular at the time. Huey Long. Huey Long was famous for the saying, "Every man a king." He believed, again, that there should be a complete equal distribution of all wealth, that the state should get everybody to work and pay everybody equally. The government should run all the businesses. Nobody should make more than anybody else. And I wish I had some soap I could wash my mouth out having said that stuff. I mean, you know, there's nothing you could say that I could agree with less, folk. But anyway, he decided he was going to, he felt like he was really popular enough to take on Roosevelt. So he was going to run against Roosevelt for president. Unfortunately, he was shot and killed. If you watch the movie JFK, which came out in 1990, his son was interviewed. His son took his place, but his son never achieved his dad's popularity. But his son became a Louisiana senator. Huey Long was from Louisiana. His son believed to the day his son died, that his father was killed by the same forces that killed John Kennedy, the same conspiracy group. That's a deep subject. I can't get into it in much depth here, but anyway, Huey Long. Now, Dr. Townsend, same thing. Dr. Townsend, Huey Long said we ought to share our wealth. The rich ought to share their wealth with the poor. Dr. Townsend wanted a more equal distribution of income, and folk, in my reading of your book, reading the next several chapters after this, your book will talk about, but there was a big disparity between the rich and poor. There was a big disparity of income between the rich and poor. I have to say, well, so what? Let the rich get richer. They'll eventually hire the rest of us. Did I talk to you about Walt Disney last class? Okay, yeah. Walt Disney built Disney World, yes. But he didn't pound one nail, didn't lay one brick. But nevertheless, he built Disney World. I mean, he hired workers to build it for him. Well, he sat back and, he didn't sit back. He diligently planned it. He drew up the plans. He hired the workers. And the workers built Disney World. Today, Disney World is the #1 employer on one location. What if you wouldn't have had the money? We'd have no Disney World. Also, there's a private firm that's doing what the government is too poor to do right now. This private firm is wanting to send men to the moon and men to Mars. SpaceX. Some of you might have heard of it. They're going to launch a rocket to the space station as early as Tuesday, provided it doesn't get delayed. That's done by a man who is a multi-billionaire. Well, what if all his money had been taken from him and redistributed equally among the rest of us? we'd have no space program. I mean, at least because our government can't afford one right now. Well, we have a program, but you know, are any of you aware that we're having to pay the Russians $20 million a man for every man we send to the space? We have to depend on them to get us there because we don't have the capsule or the rocket to get us to the space station now. At least one of you is aware of that. We have to depend on the Russians. The space shuttle got old and had to be retired. All right. Now, in the meantime, a little bit off the subject of economics, dust storms. The dust storms are brought on by people living in the Great Plains who overgrazed the land, tried to put more horses and cattle on the land than could handle. I'm talking about the states of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and the 2 Dakotas. This Great Plains region became a desert all of a sudden. Then the wind started blowing and it blew the dust all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. We had a dust storm here in 1974 and 5, but nothing as severe. This dust was so severe it killed a lot of people, particularly in the Great Plains. The people had to wear handkerchiefs over their noses just to breathe. And the ones who they had to try to stay in their houses and cover their houses. The cracks in between the doors and windows, tried to cover those with cloth. And of course, if they built a fire to keep themselves warm in the wintertime, they ran a risk of getting carbon monoxide poisoning because the carbon monoxide had no good way to get out. The house was not ventilated. If they'd opened up a window to ventilate it, all the dust would have come in. Carbon monoxide is a painless killer. And if you get carbon monoxide poisoning while you're asleep, you'll probably never wake up enough. You not realize you're dying. By the time you realize you're dying, if you're awake, you can't move, it's too late. You better hope somebody comes along and can help you. It's a painless way to die, but it's still death. But anyway, the dust storms came along, and they were really, really deadly, as if we didn't have enough trouble already. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, called for an end to racial and gender discrimination. Now, she wanted women to be treated more equally, and she wanted to end racial discrimination. She also, we're going to find out later in the chapter, she worked to try to end lynching. But here is the problem, and folks, this is the problem with democracy. You might say, wasn't it obvious that lynching was wrong? Yes, but her husband, the president, needed the votes of Southern Democrats in order to get into office. He didn't want to offend those Southern Democrats. In those days, the South was called the Solid South. I'm not going to write it down. The Solid South, because the Southern states always voted Democrat. It wasn't until 1920 that one state finally voted Republican during a Republican landslide. That's ironic, because today the Southern states almost vote solidly Republican. The switch occurred gradually. But in Roosevelt's day, the Southern states always voted, in fact, all voted Democrat. At one time in the state of Georgia, there was only one party, the Democrat Party. And when a man got the nomination of the Democrat Party, he was a shoo-in for the office. Or a woman got the nomination. This was true throughout North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Florida. Solid South. Always voted Democrat, and Roosevelt did not want to offend them. Now, into this scenario stepped John Maynard Keynes. Now that book, that word looks like it should be spelled Keynes, and I used to mispronounce it. Then I heard better. It's Keynes, as in C-A-I-N. All right. Anyway, John Maynard Keynes came up with an economic theory that when a depression occurred, the government should spend its way out of. In other words, the government should, to get the economy moving, should lower taxes and spend like crazy on things like building bridges, roads, public parks, anything that was needed. And there was always roads to be built. There's always bridges to be built. Like I said, right now our infrastructure is so bad that the government needs to spend billions to revamp our nation's overpasses and bridges. Okay. Now, you notice if you listen closely, I said two things. The government should lower taxes and spend like crazy. How can you do that, folks? The answer is the government borrows the money. Okay, here's what John Maynard Keynes said. Once the Depression is over, you pay back what you borrowed. That's where his economic theory went wrong. Roosevelt never read Keynes's book and never actively practiced it, but a lot of European countries did. They tried to spend their way out of the Depression, but when the Depression was over, first of all, a war broke out. Second of all, the government could not stop spending. It became a habit. And the result is the countries of the world have gone deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and then deeper still into debt. A lot of persons fear it might eventually all come crashing down in on them. Time will tell, but that part of Keynes's prediction never came, that when the Depression is over, the governments can get out of debt. During my lifetime, federal government has only balanced its budget 3 times. 3 times. Richard Nixon did it once in fiscal 1969, and then Bill Clinton did it twice. We'll talk later about how that both men did it. If it's gotten to where politicians don't even promise that anymore. Balance the budget with all the demands made on the government. Now, some of you folk seem to think that the United States government is a bottomless well of unlimited supplies of money, that we can have all that we want of it and everybody can reach into the public pot and pull out all that they want. Someone said that democracy survives until the common people learn that they can dip their hand in a public pot. Now, who said that? Nobody knows. It's a saying that got out there, and everybody said, hey, wait, who said that? Well, they point to some Scottish philosopher, but when they page that Scottish philosopher, but I can't find it in his writings, we don't know who said it. But it was said. Democracy will work till the common people find they can dip their hand in a public pot. And it won't work anymore. Anyway, Keynes' economic theories. All right, now Adolf Hitler practiced it. And he got Germany out of depression. Yes, at what price? The price of freedom. Mussolini got Italy out of depression. Every man, all right, well, he sent all the women home. He said only men should work. The women should stay home and tend to the house and bear children, and bear a lot of them, because we want to build a strong army and we need a lot of babies. So he sent the women home. And every man who was not able to find jobs, he drafted in the army. And that way everybody's working. The army at least provided food for them and shelter and clothing and gave them a little bit of money. In those days, army pay was poor compared to what it is today, but at least they got a place to stay and food and clothing, shelter, anyway, food and clothing, and a place to stay, and a little bit of money. So at least officially they were employed. All right. 1936, it was election year. Roosevelt ran against Alf Landon, and this is something your book doesn't mention, but I got to throw it in. A magazine predicted that Alf Landon would win. This magazine based it on a poll it had taken that today we use. The poll was a telephone poll. These people got on the telephone and called the people on the telephone randomly. Every fifth person in the line they called. Anybody know what was wrong with that way of taking poll in 1936? Anybody know? Anybody? Only the rich had telephones. The rich were for Landon. So this paper predicted a Landon victory. Landon got 8 electoral votes, the biggest margin of defeat in all of history, American history, up to that time. Now later there were other defeats, but Landon lost badly. The magazine that predicted a win is no longer in existence. All right. Now, here's the thing now, this reminds me of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon won in 1972 by an even bigger margin than Roosevelt had in 1936. And in both cases, shortly afterward, they had their plow cleaned. In the case of Richard Nixon, he was forced out of office because of the Watergate scandal. But now in the case of Roosevelt, the Supreme Court ruled the NRA and the NIRA to be unconstitutional, owing to, they said it was the government interfering too much in business, that business was supposed to be private, and the government was taking too much on itself, and therefore it was unconstitutional. Roosevelt became very upset. Now, he had read the Constitution. The Constitution, folk, does not say how many justices should be on the Supreme Court. And he recalled enough history to know that when Andrew Johnson was president, 2 Supreme Court justices retired, or died, whatever, and the number of Supreme Court justices went to 7. So Johnson tried to appoint more, and of course Johnson was not popular, so the Senate would not approve of any of his appointees. Then Grant became president, with only 7 justices on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court made a decision against Grant. Well, Grant was allowed, he was a popular president, he was allowed to appoint 2 more justices, and they ruled in his favor. So Grant got past the Supreme Court by appointing 2 justices. So Roosevelt said, hey, I know what I'll do. I'm going to appoint 7 justices and make the number of 16, from 9 to 16. I'm going to appoint 7 justices, get the Senate to approve of it, and then the court's going to vote my way. Didn't work. Both sides came down hard and said, hey, this is a violation of separation of powers. This will set a bad precedent. As much as we might not always agree with the court, we must not curtail the power of the court. And from that day to this, presidents have been afraid to deal with the Supreme Court. Anyway, he tried to pack the court. He was defeated. It was a very embarrassing defeat. But in the long run, he won. He was able to appoint 8 justices. I mean, any man who serves 12 years as president is going to eventually appoint justices. So he served his 12 years, and he appointed 8 justices of the 9. 8 times. And he got the court then to reverse its old decisions. Now, I want to say about his justices. 4 of them had no judicial experience whatever. Now, when George Bush Sr. tried that in the 1990s, it created quite a stir. This woman has no judicial experience. But hey, Bush said, well, Roosevelt's appointments didn't either. Well, they didn't care about that. Justice Black was a known member of the Ku Klux Klan in his younger days. He got through anyway. But anyway, the justices that Roosevelt appointed began to reverse the decisions that had been made before, and the court took on a liberal stance that was to last for a good many years. All right. In 1937, there was a slight economic upturn, and people thought the Depression might be ended, and then in 1938, things went down fast. At this point, Congress got discouraged, and Roosevelt and Congress lost interest in helping the poor. You might say, what did they become interested in? Foreign affairs. Things were going on in Europe that demanded America's attention. Congress did not have much interest in helping the poor, and so did Roosevelt. But one last piece of legislation was passed. The Fair Labor Standards Act. This one's still on the books with some amendments. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. Now, for the first time in history, this act set a minimum wage. I believe the minimum wage was like 60 cents an hour, and of course obviously that has been changed from time to time, but it said that every employee had to be paid at least a certain amount. It also outlawed child labor. Now there were some exceptions. Okay, no one could be hired under 16, but 16-year-old workers could be hired to do things like help old ladies carry the groceries from the supermarket to the car, things like that. Or even help do restaurant work like carry out garbage. I mean, 16-year-olds could still work, but not in factories. Factory work was outlawed. But to really be employed, you had to be at least 18. So it outlawed child labor. Let's see, it did three things. It set a minimum wage, outlawed child labor, and it set a minimum hours. In other words, any factory or any workplace that worked its workers more than 8 hours straight had to pay time and a half after the 8th hour. If you worked them 5 days and then worked them the 6 days, then the 6th day you had to pay them time and a half. If you worked them 6 days, wanted to work them